Hi, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. I love the food here, too much. And I am very, very happy to be here with my friend Tim Girvin, who is a Seattleite, a fellow Northwesterner, and who is one of the greatest designers I've ever met, probably in the world. And Tim has spent his entire life doing really impressive design things for others. We're going to show you a few of those. Just to get you kind of tuned into his sensibilities. And he has agreed to be with us for this half hour and do a couple of things. One is we'll have a conversation about what he does, and he'll be drawing for us. And Tim is beyond the word expert. He is a brilliant person in the world of calligraphy. And he has an understanding of the line and of fonts and things like that, which are, I think, unequaled, and with a strong background in Asia, in a Japanese sensibility, I think. So it's really amazing to see how this, I believe that this thread is a continuation of one that we began when looking at music and how music affects the brain, and how one person who composes music and then someone who hears that music, what is it about those two brains speaking in mathematical intervals that they both understand? They feel happy or sad or whatever. Buy more at Walmart. So here, instead of music, we're talking about a pattern language. We're talking about how to use visual things, and this is exactly what Tim is expert in. And so I'm really, really pleased you're with us. I will mention that Tim did the work for our logo for Pattern Computer, which I love. And so we've had a fun time working together recently after years of knowing each other. And I think maybe this is a good moment to roll some of the work you've done, just so that the group can see a little bit of that.
I think it's been rolling, actually.
Has it done it already?
Yeah, I think so. I realize that we're on a tight timeline, but I want to say I feel very honored being here, and I'm kind of shocked, actually, that I'm here, given the brain space that is occupying this room is kind of terrifying. And the things that you guys have been talking about is really extraordinary. So it's an honor for me to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about my thinking as a designer and how that relates to my conversations with Mark in the development of a pattern language and this idea of flow and interactivity, which I'm going to demonstrate here for a second. So as a designer, one thing is always good to be able to draw, and one thing that I tend to draw is the alphabet. But I see that movement as being flow-based. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, it's hard to get my butt out of the way so you can actually see what that is. But this movement of the alphabet, which I've never drawn in this way, I'm drawing it this way because this is the size of the screen I have, really ties to the sense about this mark. So anything that I do as a designer usually has to do with the movement between this series of strokes. How these strokes work together is kind of how I think about design. So the talk that I have is kind of a walkthrough of my relationship to pattern. And I guess, do I just sit down and go through it?
Whatever you want to do.
Okay. So my connection with Mark, as you.
We just lost your plug.
Oh, did I? No, it's back in, or maybe it's not.
Is it the plug?
Maybe it's the plug. Maybe it's the plug.
Here we go.
It's mini plugs.
Yep.
So I'm going to ask you, if you can, for a moment, just to think about this from your own perspective as a designer, as you're designing your own proposition. And so when I tend to think about design, I tend to look more deeply into what lies beneath this strategy. Where's the soul of the thing? Where's the deeper point of what the brand or the business or the person stands for? And how do you get to that treasure, that heart point, and use that as your strategy for design? So when I move through, I look at patterns of marks and designs and what they mean in terms of how they can be built into a design language or a vocabulary. So my history is about studying the history of writing and design. So I started about 6000 BC, the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian populations, and moved forward through time. Every week I teach a class on calligraphy, this kind of stuff, to my designers to teach them about the principles of letterform design. And the mark is something that's more than just a scratch on a piece of paper. It has the potential to illustrate a great deal more, which is kind of what this is trying to get to. And the movie logos and the things that I've been involved with, trying to get to this idea. So in this instance, this image is too big. Here's the most ancient mark we've found, 70,000 years old, and it's a series of crosshatches on a stone. But the point is that actually, from what we've been able to determine, these crosshatches have meaning. And that is probably the thing that I'm trying to get to with the work that I do, which is about looking for the pattern of how you create these marks, what they mean in relationship to design, into emotionality and visual presentation, and then how that begins to define space. So I see that my ideas are actually bigger than the screen here, so I'm trying to move them. But when you make a mark, there's this moment of action. And so you define space in a different way. So if I have a piece of paper and I make a mark on a piece of paper, that then becomes defined as a spatial object. And that same principle, that same mark, that same idea can become the center point to a village, or a pathway in a home, or any different kinds of propositions of design. So that bridge between the mark and the pattern is something that I'm trying to sync up. So when I think about that openness, when I first get involved with a project, I am looking at nothing. I'm trying to get to that sort of meditative point of where I begin the journey of creating a design, and then it's the open field, it's the white space, it's the emptiness. And then I begin to define direction as I continue to move through that. And this is something that I think all of you as enterprise leaders, as technological strategists, need to be thinking about the power of the mark in the context of the work that you do, and how the meaning of what that mark can represent can have an enormous amount of space. So quick piece on my background. I do actually have a scientific background. I started out as a marine biologist, comparative physiologist, and from that opening work, I got into doing journals, lab journals. I got kicked out of my science class because my lab journals were too nice. So then I started studying design, the history of the book, typefaces, things like that, and using that as kind of my step moving forward, and then meeting with different people around the world to learn from them. So my education was kind of itinerant as I was exposed to different things. But what I learned was that there's this powerful link between the nature of a mark and what the meaning of that mark is. So this symbol that you see here, this circle with the cross in the center of it, is probably the most quintessential symbolic gesture there is of the idea of the circle of heaven and the square of earth, or the 4 points of the compass. But that is kind of like the beginning of the pattern language. when you think about design, that's part of what that is. And the meaning is that lean into things of how you look for context and construct in the design of your ideas and how you move that into place. My own experience was really based on doing research in libraries and looking at books and looking at things to really understand how were they put together, how were they designed, what it was in there. And then thinking about this idea of pattern, I tend to be a etymologist, and I like to look back into the meaning of the words, not so much where they are now, but more where they came from, and what is the sequence of how those words work. So the mind and the outline, the model, this kind of principle of pattern is also part of that. So I guess in a way I'm trying to bridge some of these things together between the patterning that Mark works with in terms of his thinking, working with you and his team and kind of looking for new patterns, and then how I think about patterning in the context of design as a series of marks that have meaning that can be arrayed in different ways and organized in different ways to capture different degrees of meditation and intention. So when I worked with the Wachowskis, one of the things that we got into with this idea of a digital field, a pattern that was based on a scrolling alphabet that we created, which is kind of a combination alphabet of many different character types. But the idea was that this patterning of words became this bridge to this other environment. Kind of an interesting approach. And then this is a storefront that I worked on the design for in Jakarta, Indonesia. And the idea behind this was to take a single mark, a single symbolic pattern, and then to repeat it as a gesture throughout the space. So if you look at the skin of the building, you can see the patterning of this classical Indonesian pattern that then is used in the interiors, as well as in the floors, as well as in the windows, as well as in all these different kind of variations. And that, as a line of thinking in terms of just a mental process as well, is really kind of has that idea of pattern and interplay. So some of you, does anyone know about this book? I knew that there'd be at least 10 people here, but this is another bridge to the idea of the pattern that I find really fascinating. When I was first connected to Mark and he was talking about this idea, I thought, my God, that's such an ancient concept, this patterning, looking at new ways of thinking about patterning. But this is a concept that may be about 40 years old, 30 or 40 years old, that says that humans interact with architecture in certain ways. They interact with place in certain ways. And if you understand what that pattern is, then you can design to create that context. So it's an interesting sidebar. There's also the patterning that you may represent, that you may evidence in terms of who you are and how you gesture, how you speak, what your tells are, what the character of your own brand may be. And then in the 70s, you know that there's a patterning for code. How many people know about this? A pattern language is a coding reference. A smaller number. I was shocked when I first learned about it, but I was surprised. We got involved with a R-Chain blockchain project, and the coders were all into what is our pattern language, and I was like, have you been talking to Mark Anderson? So the mystery, what the conclusion, what the mystery is for me is that there is a sequence of how the power of the mark works. So in the beginning, there's nothing. There's no pattern. There's no recognition. Then there is a dot or a spot or a single form, which is the beginning, the first mark, which then becomes a rule, a single line, which becomes a division of space, which further defines what the plane can be. And then there is the crossing stroke, which is the crossroads. It is the most powerful point where the two axes come together, and that's an incredibly powerful symbol, as we all know. And then the circle. So the combination of these elements becomes really the primary point for how you understand the gesture, for who we are, and who you may be from a design standpoint in terms of your own thinking, the movements that we make, how we stand, what our tells are, what is our language as representatives of that. So to me, I think that the heart is between the mystery of the mark and the deeper meaning of what that represents, and then the lightning bolt of the symbol, which is what is the combination of these things? What does it mean for us? What is that representation? And this is part of the symbolic language for pattern, as you may know. So thank you.
Thank you. So Tim, if we're going to talk about flow and interaction, how would we go about having that conversation?
Well, I think that for me, the context is when I think about flow, one of the things that I teach the people that I work with in drawing and calligraphy is the flow of the movement, and being able to take your sort of mind's eye of how a letter should look and how you draw that movement, and where is the flow and the dance in that movement. Because that's where the magic is. That's where the language becomes alive, and that's where the illustration is. That's kind of the work that we do, is we illustrate language. So flow for me is really about that movement. And then as a designer, and you're looking at objects that combine with each other and connect to each other, then what happens with this mass in relationship to this mass and the space in between? What is the interaction of those things? So it could be very curvilinear, like these kind of things, or it could be very clashing and more energetic, like this big orange brushstroke that's different. So that's kind of how I think about those two things as a beginning.
Yeah. So partly you're saying it's the physicality of making the brush stroke.
I think that's an important part of the journey, is what is the link to your body.
And then the second thing you're saying with the interaction was intellectual. It was your brain seeing the positioning of things and how they interacted with each other. So it's, in a way, you're saying it's your brain and your body for you doing that dance together. Those flow here, interaction here.
Yeah. But I think that you can take that same theory and apply it to almost anything. If you approach an empty field, an open field, a white piece of paper, and you make a mark on it, or you make a big mark on it, then you're not only looking at what the mark has done, but you're also looking at the space that's been left. And so it's how those two things interact with each other that makes the whole thing work. So I think that is, and there are a lot of symbolic and allegorical ways of thinking about that. You and the nothingness, and you making a mark and then observing the mark and what changes you have made and how that changes you. So there's more interactivity, I suppose.
Yeah, a lot more, I think.
Yeah.
When to go back to the musical metaphor or comparison right now, when you are creating on this level, do you experience a sense of joy or discovery or elation or aha or through this work? Are there moments when you if you were writing the Beethoven's Ninth, maybe it would go, or like da 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 da, that works. So are there things like that that you encounter?
Yeah, I think that to me it's a combination between surprise and shock.
Okay.
Because you have developmental moments where you're starting to think, to meditate on trying to find the soul of the the problem that you're trying to get to and what that can be. And that can be a journey of discoveries and openings that are surprising. And then when you start to draw, and I tend to draw big, I like to draw bigger sort of thematic directions in terms of those ideas. Then you begin to see the scale of the idea playing out and how that could work horizontally or vertically in terms of a system or a website or whatever you may be looking at.
So I think, correct me if this is not true, I think that the Greeks used to have a feeling about sculpture where the sculpture was being liberated from within the stone by the artist.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about an open field, you see the first thing you're doing is kind of almost a meditative state where you're looking at this open field. I'm assuming that you have an inspiration, either you've talked to a client or you have a project in your own mind, and that is providing the fuel or the direction for this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got this blank tabula rasa.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so is it as though there were stone there, and because you've got a starting point in your mind somewhere, you are discovering what was in that? Are you actually finding the basic things in that particular idea or project?
Yeah, there's a Tibetan word that's an interesting word, and I would not use it in the context of myself, but when I was in the Himalayas, I went to this monastery and I connected with this little 8-year-old boy, and he was a lama or some spiritual manifestation, and he started giving me this talk in Tibetan, and I was kind of amazed, a little 8-year-old boy, but he was a terton, which means treasure finder. And so his ability is to look into things and find treasure, which is both literal and allegorical. And the thing that was fascinating about that for me is that the journey that I have working with people is trying to find that treasure, find that point. So that's going to be conversations, that's going to be working inside somebody's company, spending time getting in and listening, and then being able to draw that treasure out, to find those words, to find those points of inspiration, those flowerings where the real discoveries are, and that can be really profound.
Yeah. So I should say, if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'm not surprised to see who that might be. Chris, you have a question?
I do. We think a lot about visual design in our work as well, but nowhere near the level you do. Could you explain a little bit about your workflow? So when Mark came to you with the idea of a logo or a visual representation of pattern computer, what was next? And how did it come about that you created that visual representation of pattern computer? So how do you work? How does that happen?
Interesting. Well, to your first comment, I definitely disagree. The work that you guys are doing at SCI is really extraordinary. I was blown away by that presentation. For me, I think that, again, it's that I tend to approach these kind of challenges more meditatively. So I try to connect with people and listen to them, even workshop with them to kind of look at drawing out ideas as part of a sequence of questions, a quest or a questioning. And then I begin to understand their fluency, what their flow may be in terms of how they communicate. And then I build what I'm sensing as an instinctual strategy in my mind, where I'm just kind of feeding through ideas. I'm sure everyone here does the same thing. And then I start mapping a journey, which is usually based on drawings that I do about how I think the exploration should be organized. So that was kind of the beginnings. Meeting with Bill Mannion and Mark and the team was kind of looking at what is that, how do we organize the journey to arrive at what is the allegory of the pattern? What is that? What is the symbol of what that is? What could that be? And if we choose something like Fibonacci as a pathway, how do we illustrate it in a unique way? So,
All right, thank you.
so does that
Very
help?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thanks.
Okay. Ty?
Yes, Tim, thank you. To me, there's nothing as fearsome as a blank page.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It is. And because once you touch it, you're committed. And so I've got some message from your meditation of how to do it, but being such a mathematical and analytical person, it's more of an afterthought that I need to create something versus kind of this long journey. I'm getting some message of it, but how do you get over the blank page barrier?
Well, I think that, like I was just referencing, I think that I tend to think of that. I tend to explore the range of how I would want to look at the problem to find the pattern by the contemplative approach, to begin to just bring in the content that I have and then to look at it as a blank object and begin to think about how am I going to organize this problem.
But even the orientation of the page, I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I hate to
That's
admit
tough.
it, but it's the honest
I'll tell
truth.
you what to do with that. Just fold the paper and tear it, and then work that way. That's the easy way to break that one down.
All right, thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Ty.
Do you meditate?
Yes,
Do you often?
yes, all the time.
Okay. I sense you do. I just thought I'd ask that question.
Yeah.
Right. So, hi. So my name is Arnab. I'm a UX designer.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that I face, especially I'm at the beginning of my career, right? One of the problems that I face is that, well, actually, let me back up a bit. When you're working with people like Mark Anderson, you're working with people who are generally very curious about the world and understand that patterns and and involve things like music, and in creating a product. But where I'm at the bottom of my career, I'm kind of slumming it with people who consider what the stuff that designers do, kind of just like glorified etchings on a piece of paper, right?
Yeah.
Rather than the more important connection that we try to make as designers.
Yeah.
So my question is, and you may have briefly touched on this, but my question is, how do you actually communicate to people who don't really understand what we do, and bring them on board,
Yeah.
right, on the
Yeah.
deeper significance of what we do?
Yeah. That's a time-related issue, and I think that one of the observations that I would have, and you will have to connect so I can understand who you are, but is how you represent your brand. And it's interesting. Working as a designer, that's where I live. Is right. What is the story and how do you tell it and who cares? Right. So it does have a lot to do with the layering of the story of how you present yourself. So when someone comes to you and they see your work arrayed in a certain way, then you're presenting your story in a context that is your best case version. Right. How I started to voice this is in the 70s I used to do tattoos, bike, motorcycle pinstriping, and sign painting. Right. And talk about an interesting way to be approached. I mean, people's opinion of you is quite unusual. But I realized over time that it really has to do with how you position yourself and how you present the work. How is that represented? What mystery or magic is there? What insight? What background do you offer that changes the distinction of how you are perceived?
Right. Well, thank you so much. I
Yeah.
have a follow-up, but I think that's what else.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lorian. I'm
Hi.
talking to a lot of people that are dealing with wicked problems,
Yes.
climate, poverty, hunger, inequity. And there seems to be kind of a nascent movement to move from text and invisible language to doing a better job of mapping people's mental models of how decisions play out in complex situations.
Right.
And I wonder, you're in the designer box, but obviously you're kind of bigger than just the designer box. Have you started to see this larger trend of a shift in cognition from the visual spatial, so from the auditory sequential text? Are people starting to solve the hard problems visually using design and archetypal symbology is, and you know, you even talked about somatic stuff, right?
Yeah.
Are we shifting in how we solve hard problems?
Well, I think that's a good question. You know, in speaking to some navigation and UI related students, we talked about you know, the Journey website. You know, how do people navigate, move through that context? And it's interesting if you begin to take that, if you say, what if this was a memory palace? What if you think about this as a totally different kind of object, and how would someone journey through those things? And I think that the idea of using metaphor and allegory and symbolic thinking to looking at how to solve these problems, even mythically, even on a mythic level, is a more powerful way to get to the human archetypes that drive everything that we know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
And
yeah, I think we're way. I don't know what that means.
That means
Does that mean
151, 152, 153.
Oh, so we're like an.
1 minute. We're
Oh.
2 minutes over.
Oh, geez. Okay. Oh, is that what it means? I
Yeah.
thought it meant it was like almost 2 o'clock.
No.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, thank you.
Really, really nice.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.